Okay, well, I'm going to get started here, and I've said this a couple times, but there's this URL that you can go to. It's m3.nicetransition.com, and throughout this presentation, there's going to be some live polling that happens. So we'll be able to see results on that screen and that screen over there. So I'm going to do a quick introduction to myself. My name is Kevin Mack, and I like to say I get excited and make things. So I'm a UI, UX, front-end developer. I've been developing since 1995. I'm a part of the responsive images community, so I helped work with the use cases for the picture element and the source set. I'm also a co-founder and co-organizer of the Columbus Web Group with Adam Weiss over there, and it's a user group that meets up once a month, and we talk about best practices, methodologies, approaches, and it's a really, really great group. So encourage you to join Columbus Web Group, and if you go to that URL, there's a link out to it. So, to kind of get started, and after I've done an introduction about myself, kind of want to know more about you guys. So, this is the first polling question, and the question is, what is your profession? So, if you go to that URL, m3.nicetransition.com, you will be able to respond there. So, cool. It seems like a really, really good mix. Out of the other, what does other mean to some people out there? Product manager. Anything else? What was it? Carney. Good, good, good. All right, so cool. And I'm going to use that kind of as a caliber, but it seems like it's a good mix, so try to not get too techy or too designy. Try to meet in the middle. Doing the classic outline slide, I'm going to be covering 5 different topics, and I really want you guys to take away from today how you can look at responsive a little bit differently and bring into some different contextual factors and making the web more personalized. So that's kind of like my goal of my presentation is to go through contextual design. So I'm going to start talking about website and the current landscape of especially responsive and how I define websites. Then I'm going to go into users and some different metrics about users and usages of devices out there. Some of the numbers are really, really crazy. Next, I'm going to go and do an introduction to responsive web really quickly, kind of talk about the current state of responsive web. And then I'm going to get into contextual design, and I'm going to be talking about just some examples of how you can use these in your projects. I selected 13 different topics of contextual design. There are a lot more, but just wanted to hit some highlights on it. And then at the end, I'm going to quickly talk about project process. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I'm going to relate it into how you can apply contextual design to a responsive project. So to get started, the general question is, what is a website? And if you go out to like even Wikipedia and try to find out what a website is, it's one of the craziest, most complex definitions, and it makes it seem like no one knows what a website is. And for purposes of this presentation, I'm going to define it into 3 different things. And the first one is content. And the classic saying like content is king, I truly believe in that, but I feel like sometimes when we're developing websites, we get distracted by maybe the UI, the design, or even experience design, or maybe your boss is telling you to change the content out there. But the content's really focused around the users, and that's why websites exist. That's why people are going to your websites. The other 2 are actually UI and UX, which stands for user interface. So it's how your website looks, and then also UX, and I'm just going to give a quick definition. It's just user experience. It's how people interact with it. It's it's the overall experience of how people are interacting with your website. So where do websites live? And I like to answer this question with one of my favorite graphics, and it's from Luke Rabuski and from lukew.com, and it's his graphic on the digital landscape. And it's weird that I would walk away from this and my voice goes away, so I'll try to talk loud. But this graphic on the first line shows smartphones, and it goes all the way to desktops. So it shows small to large, and it shows everything under 3 inches up to 27. Of course, there's a lot bigger monitors out there, but first it shows that. And then after that, it kind of starts talking about the context of how people interact with this. So it has palm lap desk, which is really, really amazing. So how a person traditionally interacts with a device this size. And then where it gets really awesome is it has touch and gestures. And one of the big, mistakes people have made is the assumption that touch is only on mobile device. But there's more and more monitors, more and more computers coming out that actually have touch and gestures at a bigger screen. And also, The next one is the keyboard cursor. There's still a lot of mobile phones out there that have a traditional hard keyboard, and even I like to say that the digital keyboard still counts. But there's different events that are tied to all these and different gestures that I'll be talking about a little bit later. But this is a really, really great graphic, and whenever I'm referring to designing, I'm not really saying mobile, I'm not saying desktop or tablet, I'm talking about the digital landscape. And the way that I approach website design and development is to imagine this picture in the back of my head, and everything I'm doing is focused around the goals of meeting this criteria. So this is kind of a silly question, but it's who are websites for? So can anyone take a guess who websites are for? It's an easy question. Exactly. So websites are for users, and I like to bring that up because every discussion, when even like talking about a simple button or a simple call to action or any content that's being designed for the website, it's really all about the users. And as we get into contextual design, it gets more and more important that every single thing that you're doing on a website is for users. Again, it's kind of a no-brainer, but I can't stress how important it is that everything that you're doing for website design development is focused on the users. So there's another poll question here, and this is a really great question. So how many of you have a cell phone? Go to m3.nicetransition.com and answer that. Cool. So I'm seeing some responses here. It looks like 2 people say no cell phone, which I don't know if they're voting not on their cell phone, but it looks like everyone else has a cell phone. And I bring this up because my next slide talks about the mobile subscription rate in the United States. I mean, of the world. So there's a 7.1 billion population on Earth. Out of that, 6.8 billion are mobile subscribers, which is pretty crazy. And this number is from 2013. They didn't come out with a new number this year, which I imagine if they did, it would be a little bit higher. Getting into more numbers, 90% of Americans, adults, have a cell phone. So here's a question too, switching this out. How many of you have a tablet? With that, 42% of American adults have a tablet, which I think is a really crazy number if you think about it. And these numbers are from this year. Looking at this room, in which I expect that this number is going to be a little bit higher, it's 86% of people in this room have a cell phone. Have a tablet. Pretty cool. Next, 67% find themselves checking their phones even if they don't hear a notification or alert going off. I definitely do that. Numbers get a little bit crazier here. 44% sleep with their phone next to the bed because they're afraid that they're going to be missing something while they're sleeping. I definitely find myself doing this. 29% of people refer to their cell phone as something that they can't imagine living without. And I know I'm tied to my phone. I'm checking my phone every 5 minutes, and when I'm not using my phone or it's anywhere close to me, I almost get paranoid and I'm worried that I'm missing something. So I'm definitely part of this 29%. So with this, I like to say that we're a bunch of weirdos, but we really love this stuff and we want to be connected as much as possible. But as users, we want consistent experiences, and we have a lot of high demands. And we want to see consistent from desktop to mobile, and you want to see everything still being available to you and trying to get it as easy to use as possible. So with that, how can we start making these experiences out there? And one of the best ways of doing this, especially when you're focusing on the content aspect of it, is responsive web design. And responsive web design was coined by Ethan Marcotte in an article for Illicit Part in May 2010. So it's still relatively new. And kind of since then, it turned the industry on the side, and we stopped doing M.dot solutions or mobile-only solutions. We started looking at, well, how can we fit across that whole digital landscape? So there's another poll question out there, and it's just to ask, how many of you have worked on a responsive web project? And I'll keep that up. So what is RWD, or responsive web design? there's many definitions out there, and I'm pulling a classic Wikipedia definition out there because over time this has kind of matured, and I think it's actually a really great definition. So it says it's an approach for crafting sites to provide an optimal viewing experience across a wide range of devices. And I like to substitute sometimes wide range of devices to be that digital landscape. But there's other people that kind of define responsive web as just a squishy page, and you see people doing that hand gesture where the browser is getting smaller and moving things all across. And this is a quote from Adam Weiss from the Columbus Web Group right over there. This is a sarcastic quote. So he and I always are talking about website design and development, and he said, yeah, people just think of it as a squishy page. And that's my impression of Adam Weiss. If you look in the corner, I have all my sources, and it's a conversation we had. It was probably at a bar. So getting into the basics of responsive web, I'm just going to touch on like where it lives, but I'm not going to get too deep into the actual code. And it looks like 83% of this room have worked on a responsive project out of 48 people that responded. So that's pretty awesome. So the basics, and there's two main pieces I'm going to call out here. The first one is the meta tag, and this lives in the head of your HTML document. And there's two main attributes that you apply to it, and it's the name and content. So this is a common setup for a meta tag, meta viewport tag. And there's 5 different options that you can have out there, but I'm only showing 4. The 5th one's actually user scalable is equal to no. And I highly, highly suggest that you never use that. It shouldn't even be an option out there, because if you have that, it disables that pinch on the browser. So if there's an image and you want to see it a little bit closer, you can't actually pinch it because it's disabled. So that's a big no, at least in my opinion, and it takes away some default behavior of the browser and doesn't allow the user to really interact with your site the way they want to. So this is a common setup of it. Next is the @media, and this lives in your CSS. And there's 2 main parts of a media query, and they are types and features. So here, screen is being highlighted, and screen is a type. And then you have this and then that's a feature. And there's multiple features, and I'm going to show all the different variations of these can be. You can have multiple features out there. You just append the end with an and another feature out there. So this lives inside your CSS, and you put your CSS inside those 2 curly brackets. And the idea here is that you're always extending CSS properties. You're not necessarily overriding it. So best practices for responsive is kind of making sure that you don't have conflicting overriding rules of your CSS property values, and you're just constantly extending whenever you need to get out there. So looking at the media types, there are 10 of them. And I'm currently working on, hopefully we get a draft out there of a content media type, and also an element media type, so querying around the content that's on the site, which would be really, really awesome. That will save a lot of code and effort. So the 2 main ones that we probably use the most is screen. And this is kind of, it's not a requirement to have a media type inside your media query. It's recommended to have one because you can target different things. So the second one is print. So by having screen, it allows me to style just for the devices out there. But if I print, it allows me just to target what happens when I print the page. And print was probably my first introduction to doing what responsive was before I even knew what responsive was. Because around 2010, and print's been around since IE9. So IE9 came out around maybe 2011. That was like the first main browser that had it, but Firefox had it a little bit before. So the idea here was that you could print off really nice pages. So when I was working at MI Homes, we had, which is a nationwide home builder, our product plans, when people printed them off, we wanted them to look like our brochure. So we were actually styling them using the print media type and overriding all the styles. So that was my first introduction to responsive. And then when screen started coming out, and the Ethan Marcotte article was just like, this, we can do this everywhere. And then with mobile devices kind of growing in popularity, it was like, that's what we need to be doing. So the second part is features, and there are 13 of them here. And looking at this, there are some really nice uses of all these, and some of them actually only really apply to like LED screens or projector screens, but a lot of people just focus on the width and height ones, or ones that are just based around size. But there's other options out there. There's a quote by, again, Luke Rabusky from lukew.com, and he said, "Responsive web, relying too much on screen size." And to me, I think this is a really big issue because, again, everyone's just making that hand gesture about let's move the content around. But in reality, there's a lot more that needs to come into play when you're designing responsive web. So I like to say responsive web for today is more than fluid grids, flexible medias, and media queries, which that's a common description of responsive web. With this, I like to say that mobile users will do the exact same thing or will interact the same way that desktop users will if it's presented in the right way. And there are fundamental differences across the different platforms that you need to be targeting, making sure that your experiences are aligned to maybe someone on an Android device versus an iOS device. There's many studies on the difference between usability between those different platforms and also a desktop user versus a mobile user. Also like to switch this quote out with, instead of saying different platforms, with different contexts. So whether I'm at work in a business situation, or I'm driving in my car, checking my phone, or just out and about in the world. So just making sure that you're really taking in full considerations of users as a whole. So overall, there's a lot more, and as I dive into contextual design, I'm going to relate it back to all that. Getting into users and focusing on, again, users, and I'm stressing the word user a lot. If there was someone out there keeping count of user, I'm sure I would say it over 100 times in the next 15 minutes. So understanding users is the most important part when designing any website or application. And I'm going to break this down into two different sections and just keeping it very simple. So with users, first collecting data and making sure that you're interpreting it and consolidating it. And you can collect data in many different ways. You can do surveys out to your current database. You can do focus groups in person. If you have a store, you can actually talk to customers. You can have submit forms on your website. Just trying to learn as much as you can for your users and collecting that data and understanding what those demands are of the user and how you can relate them to actual designing. I could probably do a whole topic just on collecting data, but I'll spare you maybe an extra 50 minutes. So with that, once you collect the data, you create stories, and you create unique stories based off the feedback that you had. And you create different buckets for your users that you have, and you want to start seeing how different contexts and how different scenarios can come out and play for users. So literally writing a sentence, creating a physical story about this user does this and then what happens, or in this situation, what happens to the user in this zone or module that you have. And with these, you want to involve as many people in your team as possible. So bring over your IT friends, bring over the front-end devs, bring over your business team, bring over even the guy from HR, just because he probably has something to say about it. Just making sure that everyone's involved and getting their viewpoint and making sure that you're applying and relating it to business needs and objectives, and making sure that you're creating stories that really meet your users in your situation. So a big question with all this is, how will these pieces adapt for users out there? And with that, kind of an answer to that is contextual experience design. And contextual experience design isn't something that I came up with. Contextual design has been around for a long time. I just inserted the word experience in the middle because I thought it would sound nice, and I related it to responsive web. So there's a question on the board. Have you heard of contextual design? Good mix. It's almost 50%. I'm really glad that this is working in here too. I was kind of worried about it. So my definition of this is much shorter than probably than you would think, but I like to say that it's not about the device, it's about the context and the device, and I like to throw in the word user's device in front of it. And the experience, again, is focused on the user's device, and those variable factors that we can go and talk about in just a few seconds. Thanks, Eric. And I didn't call this out, but on that website, m3.nice-transition, if you have a question, I get an alert up here, and at the end, I'm going to answer questions. And if I don't have time, I'm going to be hanging out at the Cardinal Solutions booth upstairs. So first part of this, I'm focusing on the user, and the second part is going to be focusing on user's device. So there's 7 different pieces that I'm calling out here. First one's demographics. And the example that I like to give for this is if you go to an e-commerce website, the first time you go there, it may give you options for both men and women's clothes. I start diving in as a buyer, and I'm looking at men's clothes. I leave the site, and I come back the next time. The promotional items are now targeted to me, and it's made the assumption that I'm a male buyer. So it maybe drives me down the path to look at men's clothes. And there's different factors out there that can also be associated with it. So it's just age, gender, locale, and town. Ah, well, that's a bummer. So the next one is social. And giving an example of social, I'll relate it to maybe another e-commerce site. And I've worked in e-commerce, I've worked in retail, I've worked on just consumer research sites and a bunch of different industries out there. But I'm going to stick with e-commerce on this one. So if you're on a website and you're shopping, you're buying something, and I've given permission maybe from Facebook to, on the website that can then access my social graph. From there, as I'm buying stuff for myself, it may give me an alert that it's Adam Weiss's birthday tomorrow. And it says, would you like to buy a gift for Adam? So that example is just bringing in content that exists from a third party, social, and kind of alerting me to maybe make another purchase. There's many different ways that you can involve social. You can get fun, you can make it interactive. But in the context of contextual design, it's more around how you can bring in that data from the social graph and really heighten your experience. There's also a lot of like basic, great content that you can actually get to complete some forms. Thanks, Michael. Third-party integration. This one's really, really huge, and third-party can actually be from something like your CRM system or your SFA, bringing content in from maybe a vendor or one of your partners that you have out there. And my favorite example of third-party integration is the 1-800 contacts app. If you wear contacts and you need to reorder contacts, I feel like I'm doing a promotion for 1-800 contacts, but this experience is so good. So first time you open up the app, it asks you, do you have an account? If you don't, create an account. So you can use Facebook, Twitter, or Gmail. So I say Facebook. Next step, it brings in all that, authenticate it, and then it says, would you like to tie a payment method? It gives you some options. I select PayPal. So from right there, it's completed majority of all the forms for me, and all the data is present inside the application. Next step, it says, do you have a contact box that you'd like to scan? I have 2 different prescriptions in my eye, so my right eye's my weak eye and my left eye is just okay. So I scan my 2 boxes. Next, it says, well, to complete this transaction, you need to have your prescription. So it says, would you like to take a picture of your prescription? Take a photo. Within maybe a minute or 2 from initial download to just doing a few clicks, I now have a select how quickly I want it to show up. So maybe within 2 minutes, I hit submit, and 2-3 days later, my contacts come in. Absolutely amazing. And there's many examples of this, and especially with completing forms on mobile, it's something that you should really be thinking about. Location, and I'm going to bring up one of my MI examples. So MI, again, is a nationwide home builder, and we had different So we're across the country. We're in 15 different locations. And homes in Columbus, Ohio versus homes that maybe are in Texas and Florida look dramatically different. So when you went to mihomes.com, which is based here in Columbus, Ohio, over at Easton.
I don't understand base.
Cool, Siri. But it would show homes that were from the Midwest, and especially from Columbus, Ohio. So when Texas buyers were going to our website, they were thinking that we didn't sell Texas-style homes. And we saw a huge abandon rate from especially Texas and Florida. So what we started doing was targeting users from those locations and switching out the homes on our homepage and starting to drive people to the locations that they worked at. And this was around like 2006, 7, so it was kind of early on to be doing that. But we saw a dramatic increase of usage and also interactions from that, and a much lower abandon rate. Date and time, really easy example of this is a quick service restaurant, or any restaurant. When I go there, I see the breakfast menu if it's in the morning. I go there at lunch, it shows me the lunch menu, dinner menu, you get the picture. This is one of the easiest ones to integrate inside your experience, and there's a lot of really fun things that you can do. So as I'm talking about all of these are just, again, introduction to contextual design, and there's many different ways of approaching them for your solution in business. But date and time is a really easy one. Personalized content is more about the loyalty factor. This is after you already know someone. So I know customer Joe, and he's been registered with us, and he comes back to the site, and I'm going to actually bring in not assumed data, but real concrete data that I've stored on him. Amazon does the best job of doing personalized content. So I do a search for, and I'll give the toilet paper example, which is one of my favorite ones, because I go and search, and then I even purchase toilet paper, and then the next time I come back there, it's like, here's a million suggestions for toilet paper, which is always great when someone comes by my computer on Amazon and it looks like I'm obsessed with toilet paper. But they also give you suggestions on products that are related to that. I don't know what the toilet paper suggestions are, but maybe it's like hand wipes or something. But personalized content is once you know someone, you start using that data about them. Virtual and physical is one of my favorite ones, and I've definitely spent a lot of time with this. Example of this is maybe mobile payment. So I have an account that's created, and I put $50 into it. When I go into the store, I bring out my phone instead of my credit card wallet, and I create a single-use number or barcode that can be scanned there. And it kind of has that interaction from this virtual world, something that is virtually holding my money and is now converted into a true sale. There's a lot of examples that are coming out with like low energy Bluetooth and capabilities of HTML5 in the browser of how you're going to start to being able to start to interact with physical objects in a physical location and using your phone to get additional content and expanding the experience. Getting into user's device, and I'm going to say another quote. And I love quotes. I do a lot of research. I'm really, really passionate about UX and UI. So someone's probably said something a lot better than me. I feel like I barely know English. But there's a quote by Kenneth Bowles, and he said, "Mobile is a user state, not a device." So it's really focusing on people that are moving and are out and about, not necessarily the device. So how you can apply different contexts to people that are being mobile and actually interacting with the physical world. So again, user's device, and I always prepend device with user's device because, again, it focuses around the user. And there's 6 of them that I'm going to be calling out here really quickly. And the first one is echoing back to responsive web. And why I put this here, it's more about a discussion and approach for responsive web. And to myself, I see responsive as just the way that we design websites for today. And with it, it's not like you're creating a breakpoint at 768 for the iPad or 320 for the iPhone or 360 for some Android phone. It's about creating modular solutions. So every single piece of content that you have out there for your website, you're breaking it up into different zones and you're targeting it across that whole digital landscape. I even like to look at individual components and how they work across the whole digital landscape and the different contexts that are available out there. So it's making sure that my Android phone, my iPhone 6, whether it's portrait or landscape, still looks appropriate. And you don't have some weird in-between pieces of like broken design. Of course, there's going to be some kind of weirdness in some of those in between. I think I heard Brian Greene refer to that as the teenage years, those awkward moments that you try to forget in life. But the goal here is just to try to focus on modules and make the content be consistent across the whole digital landscape. And with this, over the past couple of years, and responsive again is really new. It was only coined in 2010, and now we're starting to see it. And I forget how many people here said they've worked on a responsive project. So 84% of us, 84% of you said that you worked on a responsive project, which is really, really great. And probably over the next couple of years, we'll stop using the phrase responsive, and it'll just be how we do sites. But over the past couple of years, we've learned a lot about responsive. We're still learning a lot more. There's a lot of information out there, a lot of data and research, and a lot of it's kind of trial and error and doing the research. And there's going to be things that you do wrong, and that's just kind of expected for a responsive project. But being able to adapt and change and respond to maybe some of those bad assumptions you had is the right way of approaching it. And with responsive as a whole, it's not, I like to suggest more of a mobile first approach, because we have more research, many more years of desktop, but we're trying to apply that same research to mobile. And it's almost like there's a lot to unlearn from the desktop and more to learn from the mobile, and how we can influence mobile experiences on the desktop. Conditional fallbacks, this is probably more of a discussion that you may have heard from one of your application architects. So this is the idea that you create an experience or a zone, and if someone doesn't opt into a service or they don't have that capability on their device, then you have a default. So for example, say Facebook, the experience requires Facebook. Well, what if I don't have a Facebook? Or what if I don't want to give authentication of Facebook to this application? What happens? What if I don't allow Target.com to have my location? How will I find the nearest stores? And that's location and Facebook are probably the worst to not have conditional fallbacks. I've actually seen zones on websites. I like to play with turning off location on certain websites and see what happens. Sometimes you just have a big block of nothingness. And the idea here is that you're creating content and experience for the defaults. One of my favorite topics, and I feel like people have kind of moved away from it, is progressive enhancement. So this was coined by Stephen Champion in 2003. And this is starting to shift away as we see more JavaScript-based applications. And the concept here is delivering the content first. So making sure that the content is accessible by your users that are out there, and then adding in that presentational layer, so maybe your CSS and your UI, and then enhancing it with client-side scripting. So even if you are building out an Angular app, it's almost like you need to have some kind of conditional fallback or some kind of fallback experience so users can still access your content. That's still one that we're trying to figure out with like the MVSAR frameworks, but the idea here is that you're targeting the lowest common denominator and building up on there. And you're not being completely future forward, you're being future focused. So the difference between those two is, as you're building experience, you're not looking at Chrome Canary or the latest, greatest technology and relying your experience to be based off that. You're starting to trickle some of those in by being future focused, but your experience shouldn't necessarily rely on it. Next is bandwidth, and this is a kind of a huge issue it's been a huge issue with responsive. So everyone wants to put those big images and try to make them on small screens, and then you get this 50-page download. There was a website that was listing, and I think the website's actually gone now. Maybe someone complained about it, but it listed out the largest download responsive sites. One of them, I think it was at least over 250 megs for the homepage. It may have even been 500 megs, which I don't even know how they tested that. I wonder if anyone on that team even opened it up on their phone, because there's no way that your data connection could download that much content on a mobile phone. So the idea here is also when you're designing, developing, I like to suggest building out a bandwidth budget. So as you're designing your UI and your whole interface and the content that you're going to have out there, you don't want to have every single piece of image. You want to have a limit that's out there. You also want to make sure that you're optimizing your images that are there and you're just looking at the overall performance. I like to say with bandwidth, it's like performance is design. So it's kind of one of those invisible design elements. So as you're creating experiences, you're thinking and talking about bandwidth. And this starts at the very beginning of a project before you even look at a single design. There's some nice ways to approach bandwidth for existing websites. You can kind of ping an image to see someone's download speed, to see how long it takes to download it. It's kind of an unnecessary way, but that was the hack in the early Flash days. And some of the browsers that are, some of the modern browsers actually have the capability to detect whether you're on Wi-Fi and also your connection strength. Picture element in the future to come is going to have bandwidth detection built into it, but that's probably like 3 years out from now. But there's more and more capabilities coming to the browser to detect bandwidth. So it's going to be exciting to see this. And an example of this that also I kind of want to warn people about, even if you detect someone on Wi-Fi, it may not be better than the cell phone reception because my 4G is much better than my Wi-Fi connection at Starbucks at 11 o'clock during like a lunch hour or during a peak time there. So even though you can detect Wi-Fi, you can't really make the assumption that it's a better connection. So a lot of discovery still to do with bandwidth. Input is probably the craziest growth over the past couple of years, and there's more and more inputs coming out both for mobile and also desktop. And these can be from keyboard to mouse, from touch events to pointer events to swipes to even voice and using your camera as an input, and also the gestures that are related to it. So when you're building out experience, it's not making the assumption like once they get small that swipe's available. I know I've been guilty of that in the past, and as I showed in that digital landscape image in the beginning, that swipe or touch is actually available in other places. So when you're building out a UI and an interface, you need to be thinking about if swipe is available or touch is available, how can I enhance the experience? But if touch isn't available, how does the experience actually work? So in a classic carousel example, it's still maybe you allow swiping of the images back and forth, but you also have arrows for people to navigate back and forth. So that's a cheesy example because I hate carousels, but at least it gives an example of input. And Jason Grigsby actually had a really fantastic quote about input and screen size, and he said, "We can no longer make assumptions about input based on screen size or form factor, and we probably never should have," which I think is a really, really awesome quote. And Jason Grigsby's the man. Attentive user interface is growing definitely in popularity, and we're starting to see more and more of these come through future specs. So attentive user interface, easiest example that I can give is I'm working in Excel, and I hear a little ping in the background, and I'm immediately distracted by that noise, and I go over to my browser and it's Facebook. Someone has commented on my image, and now I'm on Facebook for the next 5 minutes. So it's the idea of interrupting a user when they're outside of your experience. One of the cool specs that are coming out is the push API, which will be coming in hopefully in our lifetime, which will allow push notifications from mobile web as a whole. So push notification is the idea on like a mobile app, someone comments on your Facebook, or you have some kind of alert from an app that is inactive in the background, and some kind of pop-up happens. On iOS, you have the little badge. So it kind of disrupts you or notifies you that something's happening. And that is something that's being worked on that will be available in the browser, which will be really, really cool. So here are the 13 that I kind of listed out here. So question on here is, have you worked on a contextual design project? So if you go to m3.nice_transition, you can respond on that. So as that's populating, can someone give an example of one of their projects? Calling someone out. Come on. There's 17 of you. Who's the brave 1 out of 17? I'm going to start crying if no one answers. All right, what's up?
So I was working on a website for a college, and we wanted something where users could come in, and basically you would, the mobile experience, you wouldn't give them the full course load and all the content because of A, bandwidth, and B, location. So we really focused on stuff that was, what do you need to know? What time are your courses? What are your grades? What's your homework? But not trying to deliver all.
Awesome. Any other quick examples? And thank you. If I had a prize, I'd give you one.
I got one. Worked on an app recently where they're trying to find their closest power station, and usually it's based on GPS, and if they've got it disabled or that security feature's turned off, then they just present them with the manual list of the top 5 ones.
Oh, that's an awesome one. Thanks. So now getting into project process, kind of talking about how we can relate this to contextual design because, you know, I'm talking at a high level about all these things and kind of introduction, but I'm hoping that it has you thinking about your current experiences and maybe future projects that you have out there. So I'm obsessed with project process, and actually when I was at my last job, which I worked at Resource, and for a year and a half, I spent majority of my time focused on project process. So dedicated a huge chunk of my agency life working on project process, but even before then, it was always like how we can create experiences that are meeting business objectives and the user. So, see, Michael? Caffeine. So, a quick question here, which I don't know if we won't be able to see the results right now, but it says, do you currently work in a waterfall, agile, or some kind of form of agile experience process? Awesome. Nice. I like that. So it seems like the winner here is an iterative process or some kind of form of agile. And I'm going to circle back to that in a couple of minutes if we have time at the end. But that's kind of my process. I definitely believe in agile. I'm not going to slam agile as a whole, but I believe in more of an iterative process and looking at different pieces that are happening at the same time and really the collaboration of your team. So I break it down into 4 different buckets, which is core, define, architect, and review. And for a project that I'm working on, I kind of create one of these overviews, and they're going to be custom based off of the project that I'm working on. And I'm not expecting you to be able to read all that small text, and this is actually an example of one of my projects that I worked on. And the first one over here on the far left is really about the discovery strategy, understanding what the project is, understanding what the tech stack is, the limitations and capabilities of your technology that you have out there. So it's the discovery, the defining, understanding your users, the research that's going on there, which is really going to lead to the rest of the project. Second column, so the define, is about getting into the creative concepts and starting to really plan for the next column, which is the architecting and where you're going to be doing the majority of your work. And all these different pieces are happening at the same time, and they're happening by different people, different teams, and everyone's really communicating and working together. So another call out is I don't have any handoffs or deliverables in here, and that's different per client that you're working with. And I go to a lot of talks about like process, and I hear people talking about it. It's like, well, you never have a sign off. And it's like, well, that doesn't work for me because my client wants to see what the homepage will look at. So you're gonna have to customize this for every client that you work for, and just, it's more about the conversation. So if you are showing a proof or a design, it's a conversation that this is more of a concept as opposed to this is a contract and it's going to look like this, because we know that it's not going to look like that once it's done, especially if it's a responsive project. So in this architect one, this is kind of where you spend majority of your time. Your teams are kind of looping around, and this is where you actually start working on the code, design, developers, designers are working together, all your teams are communicating, collaborating, and at the end of this is where you get your final deliverable, or what I like to refer to as like a phase one of your project. Because as we move into the last column, which is review, I see every project just as a timestamp. So there's a deliverable, there's a phase. And the review is to check back and make sure what we did actually worked and it was right. And then you can kind of go back to the architect or even back to define and start re-architecting solutions. So you're looking at individual pieces and how they're actually performing out there. And this kind of goes back, so the review can live on for many years. And it's just the idea that you're always checking and looking at how users are interacting. If there's some new technology coming out, or even like a new iPhone comes out, you may want to have a deeper dive into how your website's performing. I'm doing a longer talk on just project process, so I'm hitting on this really fast, but I'm doing probably an hour-long presentation. I don't know when it's going to be, but it's probably going to be around April with my friend Tim Vonderlo, and we're going to be diving deep into this and all the different sections and variations of a project process. But I highly recommend that when you're starting off a project, that you do something similar to this and kind of outline and bullet point how the different pieces are coming across. And this really gets into more of a culture shift and the way that people look at projects and break away from the, I guess, traditional waterfall approach, or even if you're in Agile, it's the education of what's actually happening in the project. Looking at how I apply this to contextual design, because I think that whole conversation happens throughout the whole project, but this is an example of one of my wireframes, and this is a real wireframe. It's usually gray, but I wanted to match my theme here. So I have a header and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So those are different zones for a website. I'm not even designing it right now, because right now it's just the priority. I'm setting priority for the content that's on the page. So this is a discussion about hierarchy of content and how we can meet it to the demands of the user. Then I kind of shifted into the extreme view, so small to large, and how the content may sort. And then I look at individual zones and how the requirements of the content will fit in there. So this is that one. So in this example, one for a mobile user, which is on the left wireframe, moves from that top position to kind of a third position or a secondary position. And it may be because this zone one relies, and it's more important for a mobile user as opposed to a desktop user. And when you start doing this, you can look at individual pieces. So let's say behind this section title, and it may be kind of hard to see, but this is supposed to be an image, and it's showing an image. You can start having conversations about like different contexts, and if we have a location, do we want to switch out that image? Is this a carousel? Is it going to have swipe gestures? Is it going to have arrows? Is the title going to change if we know the user? Or is this whole section going to change if we can relate them to something in our database? Even the call to action at the bottom, how is that going to relate? My next step for wireframes is actually connecting the CTAs or the call to actions to other wireframes if they're different than the global wireframe. So with all of it, I can't stress enough when developing and designing solutions, everything is done in a modular approach. So by modular, I mean you're creating it into those zones as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and breaking it down in a way that you can have those discussions. So even from a responsive approach, how they move across the digital landscape, how those individual components are going to change based off of different variable factors that you have out there, and trying to target a more personalized, contextually based design for users. One of my favorite people in the world is Ben Callahan, and he said this amazing quote. I feel like I should get this tattooed on me somewhere. But it says, modularity is a requirement of maintainable systems. And I feel like this kind of quote comes up too late in a project. And I feel like every kickoff meeting, someone should quote this or put this on the door, because it is one of the most important pieces when doing development and design. And this allows you to be more flexible, especially with those contextual factors as you're breaking it down, to look at each piece and how they may change out. And then over the course of time, as you're reviewing and looking at users, how you can switch them out and actually maintain them. I don't have the numbers, but I saw a chart that was breaking down the maintenance versus the actual project. And sometimes maintenance is more expensive than the initial development of a project. So maybe the initial project took 6 months, and then it launches, and then 2 months later, you start making updates, even bug fixes. And sometimes those updates and bug fixes are more expensive than the whole project was. And that's super depressing, especially on the business side. So I spoke at M3 last year, and I actually stole a slide from my presentation from last year, and I wanted to echo it because it's related to project process. So I talked about responsive web and developing responsive projects. So I like to say let experts lead their craft, especially as you look at like that timeline of a project. Plan, collaborate, communicate, and listen to your users. And I said users more than enough times, but kind of ending on that there. And the last slide I'm going to leave up here is another quote from Ethan Marcotte, who coined the phrase responsive web. And he said, "My goal is to make the web as accessible and beautiful as possible for the people that are trying to access it." So just making sure that you're targeting people and you're still making really beautiful designs. So not letting technology kind of win over the UI or the design, making really amazing pieces of work. So I put my Twitter handle here, and I don't really have too much time for questions. I think I have 4 minutes. But if you have any questions, you can reach me on Twitter, which is nice transition. And I said that I would be upstairs at the Cardinal Solutions booth. And I see I have 3 questions. Andy asked best practices for, and I'm not sure what that means. Who is Andy? Moving on. So this is a good question, and Andy also asked target size for a safe download size for mobile websites. I don't have that number, and I really wish that I did, and whoever Andy is, I'll actually do research on that and probably tweet that out, unless someone here knows what's the preferred target size for mobile. Cool. Yeah. All right, so Dave asked, as far as tools, techniques go, what do you use? For wireframing, I actually really like to use Keynote, and that's a new move for me. There's a really awesome app on the iPad. It's called App Cooker, which also has an output, which is App Taster, which allows you to drag and drop and create wireframes and actually connect them through an experience. So all the call to actions actually click to the next page. So you can quickly prototype and come up with wireframes. For development and testing, I use a wide range, and I could talk about that for many, many hours, but I like to use a lot of the Gulp plugins that are out there and do the development that way. I use Pattern Lab as my toolkit developer for the development process, and I also use a project that I've helped build and work with, which is called Fabricator, which allows me to build custom UI toolkits. So Rob also works for a home builder. It's a long question. Rob, do you mind just saying that question out loud? Sorry.
Sure, not a problem.
Yeah.
We're working on a situation right now where when people are buying a home,
Mm-hmm.
they're using their mobile in a much different environment than if they're on their desktop.
Yeah.
What they'll expect to receive and achieve on their mobile is much different. They may be in the car, they may be out driving around. So, at working for MI, that you worked on that and found a solution for what subset of information people need when they're on mobile devices versus desktop.
Yeah, so I worked at MI, it was about now 5 years ago. So technology and mobile proliferation was still kind of happening at the time. So we didn't really have to deal with that much. I think our solution at the time, which was everyone's solution around that time, was QR codes to connect people in. A really good thing for you, especially if you have sales offices, would be to look into like low energy Bluetooth and how you can actually connect people that way as opposed to like a QR code. And tracking people around the community, it's still kind of hard, but you can do geolocation and have websites that maybe have a break off of your project or one of your product community pages that if someone is in a radius around there, maybe you change the content and make it call one of your salespeople that are around. You can also use technology that's kind of running something like this to use like Firebase and give live updates. So if your salesperson is in the office or nearby, maybe you're pinging the location of your salesperson, and if they go to your website and they're in the community, they can know that the salesperson's right by them. It's just kind of creepy, but you could do stuff like that. If you want to come talk later, we can brainstorm some ideas. So I love the whole industry. It's fun. So I think I'm getting cut off here. So again, if you have any questions, please come see me. I love talking about this stuff. And after today, I'm probably going to be going to one of the local bars around here. And not only do I like technology and UI UX, I also love to party. So if you want to come party with me tonight, let me know. I'll probably even buy you a drink. But thank you guys.